evening and welcome to the Sensual Politics 50th Anniversary March on Washington Hangout. Our plan this evening is to look at some of the unsung heroes from the 1963 March on Washington and how we as brother and sister citizens are making the world a better place based on the principles of nonviolence. We will also speak with Bennett Johnson, who was instrumental in coordinating efforts in Chicago for people to attend the march in Washington. I'm Luke Mulvey, the founder of Sensual Politics. Sensual Politics is the largest political community on Google+. We are a progressive-leaning group with over 3,700 members and are consistently ranked as one of the top most engaging communities. Our goal is to educate, motivate, and collaborate with progressive individuals and organizations about the U.S. political process. Joining us today on the panel is Bennett Johnson. Bennett Johnson is a native of Evanston, Illinois, and a graduate of Evanston Township High School. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree and a Master's degree in English and Education from the University of California in Los Angeles. He's Vice President of Third World Press, Vice President of the UCI Group, and President of Path Press and publisher of the Evanston Sentinel. Mr. Johnson also has functioned in numerous civic, social, and civil rights and political action groups in Evanston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Milwaukee. Mr. Johnson has a long-standing history of political involvement, which includes being close associate, speechwriter, and advisor to the late Harold Washington, mayor of Chicago from 1983 to 1987. He was one of the founders of the former Congressman he was one of the founders with former Congressman Gus Savage and Herman Gilbert of the independent black political movement in Chicago, forming the highly effective group Protest at the Polls. We will post a detailed bio from Mr. Johnson on our event page. Our Sensual Politics panelists today, joining us, we have Cynthia Smith. Cynthia Smith is a community manager of Sensual Politics. She also moderates the National Sensual Politics Group and has done a wonderful job today of putting this hangout together. We have Deanna Hooper and Kathy Taylor joining us, who are members of Sensual Politics. And both Ed Hong and Katie Hyde will be joining us behind the scenes, posting photos and links to the information and topics we are going to be discussing today. So welcome everybody, thank you for joining us. I'm now going to turn it over to Cynthia so she can briefly talk about our lineup.
Thank you, Luke. We have a very exciting hangout tonight. Our lineup tonight is with Kathy Taylor, who's a member of Sensible Politics. She will give a brief history of the 1963 March on Washington, and she will talk about the architects, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, and she will also give a brief account about the women in the movement and who were at the march. Then I will begin a Q&A with Bennett Johnson. We encourage people to post questions to the comment section of the event page, and our panelists will ask those questions for you. After the Q&A with Bennett, Luke and Deanna will take a look at this year's march and recap some of the events and speakers, and then all of the panelists will take turns reading excerpts from President Obama's speech today. Then we'll have final words from Bennett on our hangout. And now I turn it over to Kathy for a brief history of the march.
Thank you, Cynthia. So imagine it is August 28, 1963, and over 250,000 people have descended upon our nation's capital to march on Washington for jobs and freedom. Not only was it the largest demonstration for human rights in United States history, but it also occasioned a rare display of unity among the various civil rights organizations. The event began with a rally at the Washington Monument featuring several celebrities and musicians. Participants then marched the mile-long National Mall to the memorial. The 3-hour-long program at the Lincoln Memorial included speeches from prominent civil rights and religious leaders. The day ended with a meeting between the march leaders and President John F. Kennedy at the White House. The March on Washington represented a coalition of several civil rights organizations, all of which generally had different approaches and different agendas. The Big Six organizers were James Farmer, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, Martin Luther King Jr. of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, John Lewis of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, otherwise known as SNCC, A. Philip Randolph of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, Roy Wilkins of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, otherwise known as the NAACP, and Whitney Young Jr. of the National Urban League. The stated demands of the march were the passage of meaningful civil rights legislation, the elimination of racial segregation in public schools, protection for demonstrators against police brutality, a major public works program to provide jobs, the passage of a law prohibiting racial discrimination in public and private hiring, a $2 an hour minimum wage, and self-government for the District of Columbia, which had a black majority. Now let's talk a little bit about the architects of the movement. The two main architects were A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. Both have a very fascinating story. A. Philip Randolph was a leader in the African American Civil Rights Movement, the American Labor Movement, and socialist political parties. He organized and led the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first predominantly black labor union. In the early civil rights movement, Randolph led the March on Washington movement, which convinced President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 8802 in 1941, which banned discrimination in the defense industries during World War II. After the war, Randolph pressured President Harry S. Truman to issue Executive Order 9981 in 1948, which ended segregation in the armed services. In 1963, Randolph was the head of the March on Washington, which was organized by Bayard Rustin. Randolph inspired the Freedom Budget, sometimes called the Randolph Freedom Budget, which aimed to deal with the economic problems facing the black community, particularly workers and the unemployed. Despite shunning from some civil rights leaders, when the movement came to an unprecedented mass gathering in Washington, Randolph pushed Rustin forward as the logical choice to organize it. A few weeks before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, Senator Strom Thurmond rallied against Rustin as a communist draft dodger and homosexual, and he had the entire Pasadena arrest file entered into the record. Thurmond also produced an FBI photograph of Rustin talking to King while King was bathing to imply that there was a same-sex relationship between the two. Both men denied the allegation of an affair. Rustin was instrumental in organizing the march. He drilled off-duty police officers as marshals, bus captains to direct traffic, and scheduled the podium speakers. Eleanor Holmes Norton and Rachel Horowitz were aides. Despite King's support, NAACP Chairman Roy Wilkins did not want Rustin to receive any public credit for his role in planning the march. Nevertheless, he did become well known on September 6, 1963. Rustin and Randolph appeared on the cover of Life magazine as the leaders of the march. Finally, there were many women behind the scenes at the march and were almost excluded from the program until they approached the directors of the march. As history and the program reviews, a tribute was paid to the following women at the march: Daisy Bates, Diane Nash Bevel, Burley Evers Williams, Prince E. Lee, Rosa Parks, and Gloria Richardson. More links are given to the event page about the stories of those courageous women. Now I'll turn it back over to Cynthia for her Q&A from one of the Chicago area unsung heroes, Mr. Bennett Johnson.
Thank you, Kathy. And welcome, Bennett. We are very honored to have you here, and glad that you can talk to us about your experience with helping organizing the march. So can you tell us how you came to participate in organizing the march?
I'm sorry, I lost your question.
Can you tell us how you came to be participating in organizing the March on Washington, the 1960s?
But I have to kind of do a little history thing, because
okay.
I think I was at UCLA, as it was indicated earlier, and I was the head of the NAACP at UCLA, the student chapter. And as president, I sat on the board of the LA branch, and a member of the board was a man by the name of John Dial with the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. King came to Los Angeles in '55 to raise money, he and Abernathy. So Dial insisted that I meet King. so I met him. The next year, the NAACP had a convention in San Francisco, and we had a student delegation that drove up there. King was supposed to get an award from the NAACP, but Wilkins would give him an award only on one condition, that he could not speak. He could not make a speech. To accept the award, take a photograph, and walk off. So when the youth found out about it, we began to lobby, and we lobbied successfully, and that's how I became acquainted with Dr. King, Abernathy, and Rosa Parks, and we won, and King had spoke at that convention. In 1959, and this is critical, the NAACP decided to have a March on Conventions movement, where both the Republican and Democratic convention would have a march demanding that a civil rights plank be in the platform of both parties. The Republican convention was in Chicago, and that's where they nominated Nixon and Lodge. I, along with a fellow named Tim Black and a few others, were key in coordinating the thing because I went to Roosevelt College with Harold Washington, Gus Savage, and a guy named Dempsey Travis, who at that time was president of NAACP. So we organized, and what's key about that is that that was the first time that A. Philip Randolph, Whitney Young, Jim Farmer, Martin Luther King, that was the first time they all came together peacefully and in close collaboration. So that march, again, was the largest march in the history of Chicago up to that point, and also it was a predicate, a template for what happened in 1963. In 1963, Andy Young came to meet with me and a fellow named Edwin Bill Berry. Mr. Berry was head of the Urban League in Chicago and was key to the power brokers and, shall I say, a liaison between the power brokers and the black community. And Andy wanted to know if we thought it was feasible to have a march on Washington, would we cooperate? And the answer, of course, was yes. And Bill Berry had the responsibility of getting the money and other folks together, and mine was coordinating the whole thing. So that's how I got involved. Did I answer your question?
Sorry, I had my mic on mute. I said awesome. So, did you know that you were making history at the time?
Well, you don't know you're making history because if you're in the movement, you're in the movement. And what may be a challenge today may be history tomorrow. So the key was that in Chicago, Chicago is a power community, over against like in New York and Los Angeles. And whatever you bring to the table, you don't bring phony stuff to the table. You have to, if you say you're going to do something, you have to do it. If you say you're going to be a political thing, you have to do it. And so our whole operation and our whole mantra was getting results. And so the March on Washington was getting results for Dr. King and what he was trying to do, and A. Philip Randolph, of course, who was really the key thinker and planner behind the whole thing.
And have you met him prior to that? Because he was with the Pullman Porters.
Well, I met him when he came to Chicago for the March on Convention. He had a man by the name of Norman Hill, who was his key organizer in the state of Illinois. And Norman Hill and we had a close working relationship for as long as he was involved.
What specific things did you do in terms of organizing for the March on Washington?
Well, first of all, we had the cooperation of the United Packing House Workers of America, which was the key union in Chicago because of the stockyard. So we used that facility for our headquarters. And at that headquarters, we did all those things that are necessary for organizing and getting people together. And the other part of it was that it was a movement. So that meant that you talk about unsung heroes. unsung heroes were all over the place. They organized, they put people together, they got chartered planes, trains, buses, cars. It was an amazing event.
So talk a little bit about growing up in Evanston. As I mentioned earlier, Evanston is considered one of the more progressive northern suburbs in Chicago, which is the first suburb north of the city. So talk about your experiences of growing up at that time.
Well, Evanston was always in my lifetime, a segregated city, strictly segregated, where 85% of the blacks lived in a contiguous area. There were few that lived outside of that area, but they were few and far between. We had an all-black school, and there were no Jews in Evanston. There was one Jewish family. A guy by the name of Greenberg had been architect with Perkins and Will. Perkins and Will built the high school, and so he was the only Jew in Evanston that had a house. And I mean, may have been, in fact, there were some on the faculty of Northwestern, and that's a whole other story. But in the mid-50s, late 50s, we marched for open housing, and that's how Jewish people came into Evanston, including at mikveh and several other highly effective and involved personalities.
I had no idea, as I mentioned to you, I lived in Evanston. I knew it had been a dry town, but I had no idea that of some of the history of Evanston. And when you marched and did some of those things, what was the reaction for most of the population?
In Evanston? Well, see, there had been a change. See, when I was in high school, I was involved in organizing a chapter of CORE in Evanston. So we had sit-ins in the late 40s in those restaurants that wouldn't serve blacks. And we were successful. And in fact, one of the guys who was involved in the organization became one of the national leaders of CORE, A.C. Thompson. So we opened the theaters and the restaurants in Evanston so that blacks could go anywhere they wanted to. And also the same thing was true of the stores. They wouldn't let black people try on clothes. So all those things happened while I was in high school.
Wow, I had no idea. So I'm going to open up questions for the other panelists. Kathy, Deanna, and Luke, do you have any questions for Bennett?
Sure. I would like to ask you, how do you feel about where we as a country have come as civil rights, especially with today's march? And 50 years ago, did you see the country being the place it is today? Have we not come far enough? Do you want to talk a little bit to that?
Well, one of the things about being involved in the struggle, if you're not optimistic, you have no business in the struggle. Because you have to believe that, like they lift every voice and sing, hope unborn has died. And we knew that we had faith, and we believed that what we were doing would be successful. So it wasn't a shock or surprise, of course, electing Obama, because we had been successful before that, including the election of Harold. There has been clear progress. In fact, what's often missed is that W.E.B. Du Bois died on August 28, 1963, the day of the march. Wow. So I consider the march as the end of the beginning, because after that march, several things happened. The legal segregation ended. Washington became a municipality unto itself with some limitations. In other words, things began to happen. And so there's been movement, there's been progress, but the key element of discrimination in every society is economics. In any society, it's always economics. We were slaves, African Americans were slaves, because of the fact we were economic base for this capitalist system. So that has not changed, except there's been some shift with the Hispanics being the new neo-slaves, shall I say. So the key, of course, is to change the economic relationship between the so-called 1% and the 99%. That's when you'll see these other racial and other kinds of things fall apart, fall away.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. So, in your efforts to, as you were putting together the organization here in Chicago, you know, what was the tone like here in this city? Because we know that it was several years later, or a few years later, after the March on Washington, when Dr. King came here to Chicago and was not met with a favorable response. So, what was the climate like here in Chicago?
Well, as was mentioned earlier, we were involved in independent politics. So we had people in the community in the primarily predominant black wards who helped organize because they already were doing organization for politics, so it was simple to alter that and modify it going through a civil rights thing. Mayor Daley did not put the kibosh or the hex on the march because for what reason? You know, it didn't affect him locally, politically, so he did not stand in the way of us organizing directly at all. He didn't help, obviously, but he did not say don't do that or prevent the political leaders from getting it up. The leaders meaning the aldermen, etc., who wanted to go. There weren't that many, but they were not told, they were not prohibited from getting involved. Now, if you want
I
to
have
know, when he came to Chicago, that's a whole nother story. I guess I should say this. Um, Going back a little bit, in 1960, I was teaching high school at Farragut High School and working with Gus Savage and Herman Gilbert on a community newspaper. So we invited King to come to Chicago, and which he did, to speak. Abernathy called me, and this is during the sit-in movement, and said they wanted to raise some money for the kids at Alabama State. So three young men came up to Chicago and spoke. We raised $1,000. And this is 1960, 61, so it was a substantial amount of funds. And one of my fellow teachers, Tim Black, who taught history, wanted to have one of the young men come to his class, which he did. And then at the time, Farragut was about 20% black, balanced Polish and Eastern European primarily. And so around 1 o'clock, I taught English, so it wasn't appropriate for the young man to come to my classroom. At 1 o'clock, I got a call from the principal who knew I was involved, and he was raising hell. He was so angry because the young man was telling everybody that they had to be involved. They could not just stand back and not be involved in the movement. So he was very angry about that. And that ended my teaching career shortly after that, at the end of the term. But the young man who came stayed with me that year. So he wanted to meet Dr. King. So in 61, I believe it was, when SNCC was organized in Raleigh, North Carolina, I took him to meet King, and he and King hit it off, and he became one of King's right-hand men. Name was Bernard Lee, later Reverend Bernard Lee.
Well, I have a question. Well, I think he was answering Kathy's question.
Yeah.
Well, one of the questions that I have for you, it seems that after the Civil Rights Movement, African Americans experienced a season of prosperity where you have a lot of prominent African Americans today who don't really feel that there is an issue with racism or that the civil rights issue is no longer relevant and that they don't really understand it. What do you think is the problem of how we can relate to our youth and those who are still struggling, how we can bridge that gap so that everyone would see that it's still a relevant issue and it's going to take a collective collaboration to help move the movement forward. So what's your thoughts on that?
Well, that's one of the perils of being successful, because as people become middle class, able to buy a television set, eat every day, drive to work, take vacations, they tend to forget that they have their cousins and other people or relatives or friends who are still impoverished. They think that they have made it. In fact, some of them have made it, Oprah Winfrey being an example. So that's the one of the disadvantages of being successful. The other problem is that because you have a leadership group, because the bourgeoisie that we're talking about are also functioning leaders who are satisfied. In other words, animal satisfaction. They tend to forget the issue of freedom for everybody and equality for everybody. So it requires a new retrenchment, a new sorts of organizations. Again, back in the 60s, we had several people who were leaders that we mentioned before: Farmer, King, Wilkins, etc. We don't have that now. The people who lead now lead in order to make more money or in order to do a movie, etc. And so that's what's lacking in today's world, is that the folks who have become wealthy have forgotten where they came from, or aren't interested in me, or don't want to be bothered with, and don't want to be reminded. And so that has to change, and it hasn't changed yet. It will, but it hasn't changed yet for this day.
Well, thank you. We're going to take a question from someone in the audience. It's a really good question. It's Brian Williams, who's very active in our group and a number of other groups. He asked, how do you plan to address the GOP roadblock that is stifling the Voters' Rights Act?
Well, what's stifling Voters' Rights Act is not the GOP, it's the fact that we do not vote. We don't vote in the numbers that we should. The example being, of course, when Harold was elected. When Harold was elected, well, there's several examples, but that's the best one. 90% of the black community came out and voted. And that's how Harold won. That gave him the margin of victory. If you check voting rolls now, 20%, 30%, you can't win. You can't change things unless you're in a democratic society, unless you vote. And that's the GOP. What their successes is only symptomatic of the problem of blacks not being involved, not voting, not getting down to the city council meetings, etc., not being involved, not participating in the democracy.
Bennett, how do you suggest we do that? We also do an endorsement committee where we endorse candidates. And so we endorsed Richard Holt as the New Jersey Senate candidate. And this one guy posted that he knew Cory Booker was going to win. And so he just didn't vote. So how do we get people motivated to vote and encourage them to vote, to see that they're not voting is an issue?
Well, it's a continuing struggle. It always has been. People, as I said, there are two kinds of human beings in our society. Those, as we talked about earlier, who have so much wealth, power, and are happy with like that. They may not have power, but they're satisfied with their condition, so they don't want to venture outside. Or they may feel intimidated by the so-called violence on the street. And then you have those who are struggling to survive, who get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and don't get home till 7 o'clock at night, and don't have the financial resources or the energy to do anything else except continue to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and come back late at night. So there has to be a effort to organize. That's why we organized back in the 60s, protests, the polls, etc., to do just that. And we were successful. But it takes that kind of effort. In fact, this is really an aside story. It might not even be appropriate. But in 1959, we did two things. We went to see Dr. King in Memphis. to try and get him to help support the nonpartisan Black Independent Voters League. He demurred. He said he didn't want to do it at that time. But we did get a man by the name of Russell Sugarman, Ben Hooks, A.W. Willis, several people, O.Z. Everett, in Memphis that formed a voters league and were able to break the back of the crunk machine in Memphis. Then we went, same year, we went to New York to the National NAACP convention for the same purpose. And although we weren't successful there, we planted the seed, and there were some things going on, and that's the kind of thing that needs to be done.
Yeah, I agree. Are there any other questions? I always have more questions, but I wanted to give you guys an opportunity to ask questions.
I have one more question. I was at the march on Saturday, and I watched today's march on TV, and one of the things that I noticed when looking at the historical record from 1963 is that celebrities were out in full force. I mean, you had every major celebrity during that era present at the march, like Paul Newman, Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte. But one of the things I've noticed that celebrities and sports figures, they seem to be absent from today's issues and today's marches. What do you think is the issue?
Well, again, you see, you have to just realize what was going on at that time. Is that the activity in the South, with Birmingham, with the kids being blown up, with the lynchings, and with just all kinds of activities, especially led by King. And then in the North as well, there was a core in Cleveland where a young lady was run over by a bulldozer. So there was activity going on throughout the country promoting civil rights. So that kind of energy and those kind of things piqued the conscience of some of these celebrities, plus Belafonte and Poitier and a man by the name of Clarence Jones, who was the lawyer for King, organized a lot of these celebrities around New York and so forth. Malcolm X, in other words, it was in vogue, for the want of a better word, to open up your mind, open up your heart, and do something about inequality in the United States. It's not here at this particular juncture in history.
How crucial do you feel technology, particularly television at the time, was instrumental in sending out your message? And do you feel that we have those same opportunities with things like social media, Twitter, Google+, Facebook, and all of those things to make an impact and help change things?
Well, there was the television and etc. ignored the civil rights movement during that period. The only way I was able to ever get any kind of press was that we had a mock funeral on Rush in front of the 42nd Ward of the incumbent alderman, so we got in the newspaper. But that kind of thing just didn't happen. You had to do some kind of ingenious trick. The value today is that you do have access to social media, and there's a way to reach thousands of people. One person reached thousands of people, which we couldn't do before. So if there was the same kind of focus on using social media for voting rights, for those kind of things, and there was some kind of a network consistency, etc., then you would find a change. In other words, you get a flash mob to go to the polls if you handle it around particular issues.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I think I want to just follow up to that last comment that was made, Mr. Johnson, because I think that there is opportunity, and it kind of goes back to something that Ms. Hooper had mentioned earlier as well, in terms of getting celebrity involvement now for what we're facing today, because I think people are disconnected. They don't see a need for it, because if I'm and I'm not picking on any one pro basketball player or football player, but if I've got a multi-million-dollar contract, I'm not facing the same kind of problems that we as a race were facing back in 1963. So then to go into your comment you made about social media, if we take a page out of President Obama's book and how he utilized social media to galvanize his constituency, there's opportunity, I think, if we find a relevant cause and a just cause to rally people around that and use social to gain more interest, gain more involvement, if you will. I mean, I think we saw an example of that in the Trayvon Martin case.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The disadvantage, though, is that we had charismatic figures like King, like Randolph, who were extremely articulate. People just loved them. You know, they had this magnetic personality. So, although I don't believe in the cult of personality, it can be helpful when you're trying to organize. Again, the celebrities, as I said before, you know, Karl Marx said that religion is the opium of the people. Television is the opium of the people today, because you can sit in front of your television set and forget about the whole world because it's right there in front of you. You got music, sound, color, etc. And the other important part of it is that in the past decade, you got ordinary black people and Asian people. You don't have just all white vanilla people anymore. And all those things are part of the magnetism that keep people in front of the television, in front of themselves, thinking about themselves, and not thinking about what's going on outside their doors or down the street.
I don't think you would get any argument from any of us on the panel or anyone probably in our larger audience. So, are there any other questions, Luke, or are there questions from the audience? So we're going to continue. We're going to come back to you, Bennett, because we do want to hear some final words, but we want to sort of move on about the march today.
All right.
And sort of recap some of the excerpts from President Obama's speech.
Okay, I can go and come back, you say?
Yes, that would be fine.
What time shall I
no,
come
but
back?
you could stay on. You could stay on the screen. That's fine.
Okay.
It shouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes. So.
All right, fine.
So the next part we're going to discuss with Deanna and Luke. We're going to talk about today's march and some of the things that happened there today. Deanna?
Thank you, Cynthia. One of the people that connects to the march like no other, I believe, is John Lewis, because he's living history. He spoke at the march in 1963 and on the march today. He was from Alabama, a son of a sharecropper, and one of the chairpersons for the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. He currently is a U.S. representative for the 5th District of Georgia, and according to the Zen Project's website, he delivered what some call the most militant speech of the day, and that was after he had toned down the text of the speech. He was also the youngest member to give a speech at the 1963 march. Many members of SNCC helped write the speech that Lewis planned to give. Some of the organizers of the speech in Washington were uncomfortable with what they considered the radical content of the SNCC speech, and they asked Lewis to change it. The original speech included references to the black masses, revolution, and called the Kennedy administration's civil rights bill too little, too late. Lewis and other SNCC staff agreed to make the changes in the speech, mainly because of the respect for Mr. A. Philip Randolph, who expressed his strong desire that the march not fall apart because of external discourse. And also, they didn't have the time for his speech in its entirety, but wanted to read a couple of the opening paragraphs and final paragraph of the speech. And here is some of Mr. John Lewis' speech. We march today for jobs and freedom, but we have nothing to be proud of. For hundreds and thousands of our brothers are not here, for they are receiving starvation wages or no wages at all. While we stand here, there are sharecroppers in the Delta of Mississippi who are out in the fields working for less than $3 a day, 12 hours a day. While we stand here, there are students in jail on trumped-up charges. Our brother James Farmer, along with many others, is also in jail. We come here today with a great sense of misgiving. It is true that we support the administration's civil rights bill. We support it with great reservation, however. Until Title III is put in this bill, there is nothing to protect the young children and old women who we must face police dogs and fire hoses in the South while they engage in peaceful demonstration. In its present form, the bill will not protect the citizens of Danville, Virginia, who must live in constant fear of a police state. It will not protect the hundreds and thousands of people that have been arrested on trumped-up charges. What about the three young women, SNCC field secretaries in Americus, Georgia, who faced the death penalty for engaging in peaceful protest? They're talking about slow down and stop. We will not stop. All of the forces of Eastland, Barnett, Wallace, and Thurman will not stop this revolution. We do not get meaningful legislation out of this Congress. The time will come when we will not confine our marching to Washington. We will march through the South, through the streets of Jackson, through the streets of Danville, through the streets of Cambridge, through the streets of Birmingham. But we will march with the spirit of love, with the spirit of dignity that we have shown here today. By the force of our demands, our determination, and our numbers, we shall splinter the segregated South into 1,000 pieces and put them back together in the image of God and democracy. We must say, wake up, for we cannot stop, and we will not and cannot be patient. That was a powerful speech. Luke, I think it provides a great segue for you to talk about who was at this year's march and what the turnout was like.
Thanks, Tiona. Yes, John Lewis is a living legend, and he was front and center at many of the events leading up to today's march. He spoke on Saturday, bridging the past with the present. His words, as usual, were remarkable. I'm going to read a few of the excerpts from his speech on Saturday. When I stood here 50 years ago, I said, one man, one vote is the African cry. It is ours too. It must be ours. Almost 50 years ago, I gave a little blood on that bridge in Selma, Alabama, for the right to vote. I'm not going to stand by and let the Supreme Court take the right to vote away from us. You cannot stand by. You cannot sit down. You have to stand up, speak out, and get in the way. Make some noise. The vote is precious. It is most sacred. It is the most powerful non-violent tool we have in our democratic society, and we've got to use it. Back in 1963, we didn't have a cellular telephone, iPad, iPod, but we used what we had to bring about non-violent revolution. And I said to all the young people, you must get out there and push and pull and make America what America should be for all of us. We must say to Congress, fix the Voting Rights Act. Wow, those are some powerful words. So let's talk a little bit about the march today. The turnout for the march today, I believe, was in roughly the tens of thousands, whereas in 1963 it was estimated that there were over 250,000 in attendance. Another difference was the weather. In 1963 it was a very hot day, and the Red Cross, I believe, were handing out ice cubes to give to people to help them to cool down. And today we saw lots of ponchos and umbrellas. However, the weather today definitely did not dampen the spirit of the marches. Also, Bill Clinton spoke today, and he had a quote today that seems to be taking social media by storm. Today he said, "A great democracy does not make it harder to vote than to buy an assault weapon." A great democracy does not make it harder to vote than to buy an assault weapon. I think it was a very powerful analogy. Another thing to note today, that the Republican leaders were invited to the march. Speaker Boehner and Majority Leader Eric Cantor, the House's two most senior Republican leaders, were invited to speak. They were actually invited to speak, but they declined. I can't say I'm surprised, to be honest. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy was reticent about the march. Today, however, President Obama was front and center in the lineup. So now, as a group, the panelists and I are going to read some excerpts from his speech today, from President Obama's speech. Okay, so from President Obama's speech. And then on a hot summer's day, they assembled here in our nation's capital under the shadow of the great Emancipator to offer testimony of injustice, to petition their government for redress, and to awaken America's long slumbering conscience. We rightly and best remember Dr. King's soaring oratory that day, how he gave mighty voice to the quiet hopes of millions, how he offered a salvation path for oppressed and oppressors alike. His words belong to the ages, possessing a power and prophecy unmatched in our time. But we would do well to recall that day itself also belonged to those ordinary people whose names never appeared in the history books, never got on TV. Many had gone to segregated schools and sat at segregated lunch counters, had lived in towns where they couldn't vote, in cities where their votes didn't matter. There were couples in love who couldn't marry, soldiers who fought for freedom abroad that they found denied to them at home. They had seen loved ones beaten and children fire-hosed, and they had every reason to lash out in anger or resign themselves to a bitter fate. And yet they chose a different path. In the face of hatred, they prayed for their tormentors. In the face of violence, they stood up and sat with moral force of nonviolence. Willingly, they went to jail to protest unjust laws, their cells swelling with the sound of freedom songs. A lifetime of indignities had taught them that no man can take away the dignity and grace that God grants us. They had learned through hard experience what Frederick Douglass once taught, that freedom is not given. It must be won through struggle and discipline, persistence and faith. That was the spirit they brought here that day. The spirit that young people like John Lewis brought that day. That was the spirit that they carried with them like a torch back to their cities and their neighborhoods. That steady flame of conscience and courage that would sustain them through the campaigns to come, through boycotts and voter registration drives and smaller marches, far from the spotlight, through the loss of 4 little girls in Birmingham, the carnage of Edmund Pettus Bridge, and the agony of Dallas, California, Memphis, through setbacks and heartbreaks and gnawing doubt, that the flame of justice flickered and never died. But we would dishonor those heroes as well to suggest that the work of this nation is somehow complete. The arc of the moral universe may bend towards justice, but it doesn't bend on its own. To secure the gains this country has made requires constant vigilance, not complacency, whether it's by challenging those who erect new barriers to the vote or ensuring that the scales of justice work equally for all in the criminal justice system and not simply a pipeline from underfunded schools to overcrowded jails. It requires vigilance.
The March on Washington teaches us that we are not trapped by the mistakes of history, that we are masters of our fate. But it also teaches us that the promise of this nation will only be kept when we work together. We'll have to reignite the embers of empathy and fellow feeling, the coalition of conscience that found expression in this place 50 years ago. And I believe that spirit is here, that true force inside each of us. I see it when a white mother recognizes her own daughter in the face of a poor black child. I see it when the black youth thinks of his own grandfather in the dignified steps of an elderly white man. It's here when the native-born recognizing that striving spirit of a new immigrant, when the interracial couple connects with the pain of a gay couple who were discriminated against and understands it as their own. That's where courage comes from, when we turn not from each other or on each other, but towards one another, and we find that we do not walk alone. That's where courage comes from. And with that courage, we can stand together for good jobs and just wages. With that courage, we can stand together for the right to health care in the richest nation on earth for every person. With that courage, we can stand together for the right of every child from the corners of Anacostia to the hills of Appalachia. to get an education that stirs the mind and captures the spirit and prepares them for the world that awaits them. With that courage, we can feed the hungry and house the homeless and transform bleak wastelands of poverty into fields of commerce and promise. America, I know the road will be long, but I know we can get there. Yes, we will stumble, but I know we'll get back up. That's how a movement happens. That's how history bends. That's how when somebody is faint of heart, somebody else brings them along and says, come on, we're marching. That's a reason why so many who marched that day and in the days to come were young. For the young are unconstrained by habits of fear, unconstrained by the conventions of what is. They dared to dream different and to imagine something better. And I am convinced that some imagination, the same hunger for purpose, serves in this generation.
We might not face the same dangers as 1963, but the fierce urgency of now remains. We may never duplicate the swelling crowds and dazzling processions of that day so long ago. No one can match King's brilliance, but the same flames that lit the heart of all who are willing to take a first step for justice, I know that flame remains. The tireless teacher who gets to class early and stays late and dips into her own pocket to buy supplies because she believes that every child is her charge, she's marching. That successful businessman who doesn't have to pay his workers a fair wage, but then offers a shot to a man, maybe an ex-con who's down on his luck, he's marching. The mother who pours her love into a daughter so that she grows up with the same confidence to walk through the same door as anybody's son, she's marching. The father who realizes the most important job he'll ever have is raising his boy right, even if he didn't have a father, especially if he didn't have a father at his home, he's marching. The battle-scarred veterans who devote themselves not only to helping their fellow warriors stand again and walk again and run again, but to keep serving their country when they come home, they are marching. Everyone who realized what those glorious patriots knew on that day, that change does not come from Washington, but to Washington. That change has always been built on our willingness, we the people, to take on the mantle of citizenship. You are marching. That's the lessons of our past, the promises of tomorrow, that in the face of impossible odds, people who love their country can change it. And when millions of Americans of every race and every region, every faith and every station can join together in a spirit of brotherhood, then those mountains will be made low, and those rough places will be made plain, and those crooked places, they straighten out towards grace, and we will vindicate the faith of those who sacrificed so much and lined up to be the true meaning of our creed as one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. More to come. Cynthia, now I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Deanna. We're going to go to Luke to introduce Bennett and have Bennett say some final words. It looks like Bennett fell off, and I'll try to call him and see if he can get reconnected, okay?
Okay, yeah, maybe he'll be able to just jump back on. Oh, while we're waiting, I wanted to ask everybody on the panel. At 3 o'clock today Eastern Time, around the country, bells were going to be rung to commemorate Martin Luther King's speech at the exact time 50 years ago. Did anybody hear the bells where they were?
I did.
I didn't either.
No, I mean, I was watching television, so I wasn't paying attention to what was going on outside of me.
Okay.
Me too.
Okay. So I wanted to say a big thank you to Bennett Johnson, who is not here right now, but he has joined us for the beginning of our hangout and throughout. It was an absolute honor to have him on and to join us. I want to say thank you to Cynthia for organizing this hangout, for putting it together, for coordinating everybody. Cynthia has tirelessly worked for our sensible politics community, both in the voting rights area and throughout. And we couldn't do this without you, so thank you, Cynthia. And a big thank you to Diona for joining us today as well, and to Kathy. It's great to meet both of you and have you on. We appreciate the time you took to come here today. And thank you to Ed and Katie for your behind-the-scenes work. We appreciate you very much. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We will see you soon.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.